There is a video camera sitting in a drawer somewhere in Hanford, California, that started all of this. A father gave it to his 16-year-old son in 1998, and the son used it, along with Lego men and some crude paper cutouts, to make a few minutes of stop motion instead of the diorama his classmates were building for school. That is verified. That is not a theory. That is where regular show actually begins, decades before a blue jay and a raccoon ever set foot in a park. And tonight we are going all the way down into the real history of the show, the parts that never made it into any wiki entry about lore, the parts that happened in writers' rooms and casting sessions and phone calls from angry parents and a recording booth where one man did the voices of 4 different characters back to back without anyone in the audience ever noticing. This is every regular show secret, not the theories about what the park means. The truth about how the thing was built, who built it, what it cost them, and what almost didn't happen at all. I am Velvo, and this one is for the quiet hours, so get settled in, because there is a lot of ground to cover, and none of it needs to be rushed. Start with the town, because the town explains almost everything else. Hanford is a flat agricultural city in the Central Valley of California, and J.G. Quintel, the man who would eventually create regular show, has described it plainly and without much romance. It was flat. There was not a ton to do. He and his friends were constantly inventing ways to entertain themselves, and years later he would say, in interviews that are a matter of public record, that those homemade misadventures were the actual seed of everything Mordecai and Rigby would later get up to on screen. This is not a reading. This is not a fan theory pulled from a pattern in the episodes. This is the creator, on the record, saying that the show's premise is not really about a park. It is about being young and bored in a place that does not give you much to work with, and having to manufacture your own excitement out of nothing, the way a kid with a video camera and some Lego figures has to manufacture a movie out of nothing. Quintel attended Hanford High School, took an AP literature class and a pottery class, worked a string of minimum wage jobs, including one at a movie theater, which is worth sitting with for a second, because Mordecai and Rigby's entire professional existence in the show is built around exactly that kind of low stakes, low pay, high boredom labor. The parallel is not subtle once you know it is there. It was always there. It was just never labeled. Picture the actual shape of that adolescence for a moment, because the specifics matter more than the general summary. A 16-year-old kid in a farm town, given a video camera by his father as what he would later describe as one of the coolest things anyone had ever given him, spending afternoons arranging Lego figures and paper cutouts into a few minutes of stop-motion footage, while classmates down the hall were gluing photographs onto a trifold presentation board for the exact same assignment. He has said that his younger brother, Peyton Dean Quintel, was often right there with him for these homemade productions, meaning regular show's origin was never a solitary act of invention. It started as something 2 brothers built together out of boredom in a town with nothing much going on, in exactly the same spirit that would eventually define 2 coworkers filling an empty afternoon shift with an increasingly elaborate scheme. Quintel has named a specific set of influences from that period as well, citing Matt Groening, Mike Judge, and Joe Murray directly as animators whose work shaped his sensibility before he ever set foot in an actual studio, and it is worth noting that he would go on to actually work for Joe Murray a few years later on Camp Lazlo, closing the loop between admiring someone's work as a teenager and sitting in a room taking notes from that same person as a young professional. Quintel has described the specific creative culture he stepped into at Cartoon Network Studios during that stretch of his early career in terms that help explain why a show as strange as Regular Show could get made there at all. In his account, the network at that time stood apart from its competitors specifically because it was willing to take bigger creative risks and back shows that were fundamentally driven by a single creator's individual vision rather than shaped primarily by committee, an environment that let him and his collaborators push whatever made them personally laugh, secure in the knowledge that Network Notes would refine the work rather than sand away its actual identity. That same interview also touched on something more personal and slightly less comfortable about the specific price of the show's eventual success. Quintel has described himself as someone who prefers to stay out of the public eye, noting that animation work in general tends to suit people with that kind of temperament precisely because it lets you build something enormous without ever having to be recognized on the street for it, which made the years following the pandemic genuinely disorienting for him, as strangers who recognized his face and his name in public settings became a regular, ongoing part of his life in a way it had never been during the show's original broadcast run. After high school, before Cal Arts, he passed briefly through two other California schools, the College of the Sequoias and the College of the Canyons. Small stepping stones rarely mentioned in any account of his career before transferring into the animation program that would actually launch him. And once he arrived at Cal Arts, his very first real exposure to the professional side of the industry came through a 2004 internship at Cartoon Network Studios, where in a detail that has nothing at all to do with Slackers or a park bench, he worked on the Star Wars, Clone Wars series, meaning the earliest professional animation work on his resume involved a galaxy far, far away, rather than anything resembling groundskeeping. Quintel married Cassia Streb in 2010, the same year Regular Show premiered, meaning the two most significant new fixtures of his adult life, a wife and a television series, arrived within the same 12 months of each other, a timing coincidence that turns out to matter later once you learn how directly his own family life would eventually shape the project that followed Regular Show's ending. Even his hometown paid attention early. The Hanford Sentinel, his hometown newspaper, covered his success at that same 2005 Nicktoons Film Festival as one of the notable local stories of the entire year, meaning the town he has described as flat and short on things to do was, in its own small way, already keeping track of him before anyone outside of Central California had any reason to know his name. He went on to Cal Arts, the animation school in Valencia that has produced an unusual concentration of the animators who would go on to define Cartoon Network's most beloved era. At Cal Arts, Quintel and a group of roughly 20 other students, including a classmate named Sam Marin, ran something like a private ritual. They would throw words into a hat, words like lollipop or candy. At midnight, they would draw one out, read it aloud, and then sprint back to their desks for a 48-hour marathon to produce a short film based on whatever single word they had pulled. Two of the films that came out of this exact process were The Naive Man from Lollyland and Two in the AM/PM. And if those titles sound at all familiar to you, they should, because these are not just early creative exercises Quintel eventually abandoned. These are the direct ancestors of regular show. Lollyland is where Pops comes from. The early sketches of characters who would become Mordecai, Benson, and Pops all first took shape inside these two student shorts. Sam Marin, the classmate who threw words into that hat alongside Quintel, would go on to voice Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man. Three of the show's most distinct vocal performances coming from a man who was in the room, literally in the room, at the exact moment these characters were first being invented on a college deadline. That is not trivia. That is origin story. The Naive Man from Lollyland did not simply exist as a private student exercise either. It went on to win two separate honors at the 2005 Nicktoons Film Festival, the Producer's Choice Award and the Student Animator Award, each carrying real prize money and professional software alongside the recognition itself, and an established industry producer named Fred Seibert singled Quintel out publicly at the time as a talent worth watching closely in the years ahead. That means the character who would eventually become Pops, a sweet, addled old man with a lollipop for a head, was, in his very first public form, already good enough to win real industry recognition years before Cartoon Network had any involvement with the concept at all. The Naive Man from Lollyland won 2 awards at the 2005 Nicktoons Film Festival, and an established producer named Fred Seibert singled Quintel out publicly as a talent worth watching. Quintel graduated from Cal Arts with a degree in character animation in December of 2005, and almost immediately went to work as a storyboard revisionist on Camp Lazlo, a show he has said taught him the fundamentals of premise-driven storyboarding and writing with a partner. From there, he moved to The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack as creative director under Thurup Van Orman, another Cal Arts connection, because Van Orman and a third student named Pendleton Ward had all overlapped there. Ward, of course, would go on to create Adventure Time. This detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface, because it means the two shows that would eventually anchor and revive Cartoon Network's identity in the 2010s did not emerge from separate creative ecosystems that happened to air side by side. They came out of the same small group of art school friends who had been trading ideas, techniques, and eventually staff with each other for years before either show existed. Regular show and Adventure Time are, in a very real sense, siblings raised in the same house. The path from student film to television series was not smooth, and this is where the first real secret of the show's existence lives. In 2008, Cartoon Network launched an initiative called the Cartoonstitute led by veteran animators Craig McCracken and Rob Renzetti, intended to be a spiritual successor to the network's earlier What a Cartoon show. The original ambition was enormous. Up to 39 shorts were meant to be produced as a showcase for new talent, an alternative to the traditional focus-tested pilot process, giving young artists room to make something strange without a committee sanding off every edge. Quintel was invited to pitch a short for this project, and he brought Regular Show, built from the characters and dynamics of his two student films. But the Cartoonstitute itself collapsed. Financial pressure and a shift in the network's priorities toward acquisitions and live-action content meant that only 14 of the intended 39 shorts were ever finished, and the initiative was formally scrapped. If you are keeping track of the stakes here, Regular Show as a concept came within one budget decision of never becoming a television show at all. It existed at that moment as one single finished short sitting inside a canceled program, and the finished pieces from that dead initiative actually leaked online in late 2009, before most of them ever saw an official release. Out of that entire wreckage, only 2 properties survived to become full series. Regular Show was one of them. The other was Uncle Grandpa. Everything else, the other 12 shorts, simply vanished into the archive of things that almost were. In August of 2009, Cartoon Network greenlit 12 quarter-hour episodes of Regular Show, and the show that was born out of the ashes of a failed initiative went on to run for 8 seasons and 244 episodes. It is worth sitting for a moment on just how thin the margin actually was, because the Cartoonstitute did not fail quietly. Craig McCracken himself, one of the 2 veteran animators leading the entire initiative, announced its cancellation publicly, and the pieces that had already been completed leaked onto the internet before Cartoon Network ever intended anyone outside the studio to see them, meaning the earliest surviving footage connected to Regular Show entered the world not through a broadcast or a press release, but through exactly the kind of unauthorized internet leak that would months, under almost any other circumstance, have been treated as a problem rather than as free promotion for a project the network had already decided to walk away from. And the Cartoonstitute's failure was not the end of Cartoon Network's appetite for this kind of low-commitment, high-creativity pilot pipeline. That same year, the network launched a direct successor initiative, eventually known as the Cartoon Network Shorts Department, built specifically to keep greenlighting comedy animation pilots without repeating the Cartoonstitute's specific financial mistakes, and that successor program is the exact pipeline that would go on to produce Clarence, Steven Universe, and other shows that would define the network's next creative wave. Regular Show, in other words, did not just survive a canceled initiative. It became the proof of concept that convinced the network the entire approach was worth trying again, on a more sustainable footing, only months after the first version of it had already collapsed. Even a detail as basic as how many episodes the show actually produced turns out to carry a small, genuine discrepancy once you start comparing sources against each other. Wikipedia's French language entry on the series lists the total run at 244 individual 11-minute episodes across 8 seasons. Other reference sources, including entries compiled on TV Tropes, list the total instead as 261. Neither figure is simply wrong. The difference comes down entirely to how you count multi-part stories. Episodes like the 3-part series finale or the 2-part Terror Tales of the Park Halloween specials get counted as a single episode in some tallies and as separate, individually broadcast segments in others, and different outlets have made different choices about which convention to follow. It is a small, almost bureaucratic secret, the kind that never comes up in conversation about the show's themes or characters, but it is a real and verifiable inconsistency sitting quietly in the reference material, and it means that even a question as simple as how many episodes of regular show actually exist does not have one single, universally agreed upon answer. The original short itself did not disappear entirely. It was later expanded and aired as the second season episode called First Day, which means that somewhere inside the show's actual run sits a piece of footage that started life as a rejected pilot for a canceled program, quietly folded into the continuity as if it had always belonged there. Nobody watching First Day for the first time in its original broadcast slot would have had any reason to know that they were looking at the surviving fragment of something that had, by every reasonable expectation, already died. If you're watching this in the dark tonight, go ahead and drop a comment with where you're tuned in from and what time it is where you are. I like knowing how far this reaches, and it helps the channel too, so if you haven't already, consider subscribing while we keep going, because there is a great deal more buried in here. Once the show existed, the question became how to actually build episodes of it, and the honest answer is that the process was slower, more expensive, and more physically demanding than most people who grew up watching 11 minutes of surreal comedy on a Monday afternoon ever would have guessed. According to reporting from NPR that followed the production process directly, a single episode of regular show took 9 months to complete, from the earliest storyboard to the finished broadcast file, and at any given moment, the team had roughly 20 episodes moving through different stages of that pipeline simultaneously. Quintel himself put it simply in that interview. The episode plays for 11 minutes, and it's over, and people just move on to the next one without any sense of how hard it actually was to make. The workflow followed a specific chain. The story is illustrated first as hand-drawn storyboards. Those storyboards are then animated at a rough level and synced with dialogue to create what is called an animatic, essentially a moving sketch of the episode, which gets sent to the network for approval before a single frame of finished art exists. Once that animatic clears, the backgrounds and character designs are finalized in Burbank, and the whole package is shipped overseas to Seorom Animation in Seoul, South Korea, where the more labor-intensive animation work is actually completed by hand before the finished frames are sent back to California for final assembly. This is not unusual by the standards of American television animation. Shows from The Simpsons to Family Guy to SpongeBob have all relied on outsourced animation studios to manage cost, and regular show followed that same well-worn path. but it is worth sitting with the actual scale of labor this represents, because for a show that so often gets remembered as loose, sketchy, low effort in its visual style, the truth is that every single frame passed through hands on two different continents before it ever reached a television screen. By 2012, according to reporting from that period, Quintel was overseeing a team of roughly 35 people in Burbank alone just to keep episodes moving through their early stages before any of that material ever reached Korea for the animation itself, which means the 11 minutes a viewer sees on screen is the compressed, finished output of a workforce most casual fans would never picture when they think about a show this loosely drawn. Picture that office for a second, the way a visiting reporter once described it: a bustling space full of people hunched over drawing tables and monitors, each one responsible for some small sliver of a joke that would not actually reach a television screen for the better part of a year. That 9-month gap between a joke first being written down and that same joke finally airing carries an implication worth sitting with, even though it is an inference rather than something the production has stated outright. Because a script moves through storyboarding, animatic approval, oversees animation, and final assembly in that order, the writers were, at any given point, working roughly a year ahead of what audiences were actually watching in a given week, which means the version of the show airing on any particular Monday reflected who the writers had been and what they had found funny the better part of a year earlier. Whether that lag ever felt strange to the people living inside it is not something any member of the crew has spoken about directly on the record, but the mechanics of the pipeline itself make the gap unavoidable. The creative team behind the camera and the voices behind the microphone hide some of the show's best kept secrets, and this is where things get genuinely surprising if you have only ever watched the show and never gone looking into who was actually performing. Sam Marin, the Cal Arts classmate who threw words into a hat with Quintel back when these characters were still sketches, does not just voice one character. He voices Benson, Pops, and Muscle Man. Three of the show's most emotionally distinct figures, the perpetually furious middle manager, the gentle cosmic being disguised as a sweet old man, and the loud performative tough guy who cries easily and loves deeply. All three of them are the same human voice, shaped into three entirely different registers by the same actor sitting in the same booth. Watch any scene where two of those three characters argue with each other and understand that you are, in a very literal sense, listening to one man have a conversation with himself, and that the show never once drew attention to this fact on screen. It simply let the performance carry the illusion. Quintel himself voices both Mordecai and High Five Ghost, meaning the show's protagonist and one of its most beloved supporting characters share a voice actor as well, and this arrangement was not the original plan. High Five Ghost was voiced by Jeff Bennett before Quintel eventually took over the role himself. William Salyers, who has been the singular voice of Rigby across the entire run, also lends his voice to a long list of unnamed background characters scattered throughout the show's run, meaning even the crowd noise in a regular show episode sometimes carries a voice you already know from the main cast without your ever realizing it. And then there is Mark Hamill, Skips, the immortal Yeti, who serves as the park's elder statesman and resident fixer of impossible problems, is voiced by the same actor who played Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars trilogy and who has spent decades since building one of the most respected careers in voice acting history as the definitive animated Joker. Hamill's presence in regular show is one of those facts that feels almost too good to be true, precisely because it is completely, verifiably true. And one of the strangest parts of this particular secret is what Hamill himself has said about his own performance. In interviews, he has admitted with real candor that he did not think much of his work as Skips at the time, that he felt the voice was not especially distinct from how he actually talks, and that he has been somewhat confused by how many fans consider it one of his standout roles. This is a rare case of an actor's own assessment of his work diverging sharply from the audience's, and it says something quietly moving about the show's writing that a performance the actor himself considered unremarkable landed in the finished product as one of the most beloved vocal turns in the entire series. Hamill has since confirmed, in comments reported around the announcement of the show's revival, that he intends to return to the role, telling William Salyers in a direct message that there is only one Skips, and that Skips is very much looking forward to seeing his old pal Rigby again. Skips was, in fact, far from Hamill's only connection to Cartoon Network's animated ecosystem during this period of his career. He had already lent his voice to Johnny Bravo and Generator Rex before ever stepping into the recording booth for regular show, and he would go on to appear in Adventure Time as well, meaning the actor who gave voice to an immortal, silently grieving Yeti in one Cal Arts Descended series was, around the very same stretch of years, also showing up in the other Cal Arts Descended series, airing right alongside it, another small thread quietly connecting the two shows that Quintel and Pendleton Ward had built out of the same circle of friends. Hamill's voice career has only continued expanding in the years since regular show originally wrapped, taking on the role of Chucky in a modern Child's Play film, voicing a character in Amazon's Invincible, and lending his voice to a supporting role in Hayao Miyazaki's The Boy and the Heron, meaning the actor who spent years quietly grieving as an immortal Yeti in a park groundskeeper's cartoon has, in the years since, moved just as comfortably through a horror franchise reboot, a violent superhero series, and a Japanese animated art house film, without any of those wildly different projects ever quite eclipsing the specific affection fans still hold for his work as Skips. He has more animated work still ahead of him too, including an upcoming role as King Herod in a film about the life of Christ, and a separate turn voicing the Flying Dutchman in a new SpongeBob feature, proof that a schedule this varied does not appear to be slowing down anytime soon. Decades into a career most people still associate primarily with a single role from 1977. The doubling does not stop with the three headline cases. Thomas, Death's mild and ordinary son, and Garrett Bobby Ferguson Jr., the vengeful ghost of a video game record holder, are both voiced by the same actor, Roger Craig Smith, a performer whose range across the show extends into a long list of other named and unnamed characters. Smith even plays a character called Frank Smith in one episode, a small in-house joke of the kind voice actors call the Danza, named for Tony Danza's habit of playing characters who share his own first name, here applied instead to a shared surname buried in the credits for anyone paying close enough attention to notice. Courtney Taylor, who voices Starla, Muscle Man's eventual wife, also voiced both an unrelated angry background character and a separate cake shop worker within the same single episode, Take the Cake, meaning a scene can contain two different characters performed by the same actor speaking in the same short stretch of screen time without the audience ever being cued to notice. Taylor's career beyond regular show runs through some of the biggest names in modern video game voice work, including the character Jack across the Mass Effect series and the female protagonist of Fallout 4, meaning the actor voicing Muscle Man's wife in a children's cartoon has, in other rooms entirely, been responsible for some of the most recognizable player-facing performances in an entire generation of role-playing games. The show's Guardians of Eternal Youth, the shadowy order tied to Skip's immortality and backstory, are voiced by David Kaye and Robin Atkin Downes, two performers with long careers in video games and animation who brought a specific, deliberate gravity to characters who appears only rarely across the entire run, treated by the writers with the seriousness of an old institution rather than a passing cameo. At San Diego Comic-Con in 2014, several members of the cast and writing staff were asked directly, on the record, which character was their personal favorite, and the answers are worth knowing simply because they complicate the assumption that everyone behind a show loves its lead the most. Writer and voice actor Matt Price named Muscle Man as his favorite, describing him as passionate, funny, and someone who genuinely cares about his friends beneath the performance. Minty Lewis and Roger Craig Smith both separately named Eileen. William Salyers, the voice of Rigby himself, did not choose his own character, but instead named Thomas, Death's son, as his favorite. Sean Sealis initially named High Five Ghost, before later changing his answer to CJ. And at a 2025 convention appearance tied to the revival, Salyers specifically cited the episode Over the Top as his favorite to work on, explaining that he found it hilarious that Rigby could manage to anger someone as consistently mellow as Skip's badly enough to nearly get himself killed, while Sam Marin, in the same appearance, named Excellent as his own favorite, the same episode that would go on to win the show its Emmy. Quintel's own performance as Mordecai carries a small, almost charming piece of trivia buried in his own description of the process. In interviews discussing his voice work, Quintel has said plainly that he has an easygoing, calm temperament in his actual daily life, and that he never yells in ordinary conversation, which meant that voicing a character who spends a meaningful portion of nearly every episode shouting, panicking, or arguing required him to specifically learn and practice a kind of vocal intensity that did not come naturally to him at all. The frantic, high-volume energy that defines so much of Mordecai's comic delivery was, by the account of the man performing it, a deliberately constructed skill rather than an extension of his own personality, built specifically for the booth and left there when the session ended. Other casting choices carry their own quiet stories. Minty Lewis, who plays Eileen, the mole who becomes one of the show's most fully realized characters over the course of the series, did not start out as a voice actor at all. She began as a writer and storyboard artist on the show itself, and according to accounts from the production team, she was the one who wrote and pitched the line about baby sea turtle eggs in the episode Do Me a Solid, a piece of writing so distinctly, specifically Eileen in its cadence, that the moment she delivered it in the room, everyone realized she simply was the character she had been writing for. She was cast in the role she had helped invent. David Ogden Stiers, a legendary voice actor best known for playing Cogsworth in Beauty and the Beast and Jumba in Lilo and Stitch, and known to a different generation for his live-action role as Major Charles Winchester on MASH, voiced Mr. Maillard, the severe park owner who was eventually revealed to be Pops's adoptive father. When the show's cosmic mythology finally clicked into place in its later seasons, it did so through a voice that carried decades of Disney gravity behind it, whether the audience consciously registered that lineage or not. Linda Cardellini, known widely for playing Velma in the Scooby-Doo films and for her work in Mad Men and ER, voices CJ, the cloud being who becomes half of Mordecai's central romantic entanglement. And in the show's final season, the cosmic villain Anti-Pops, Pops's furious opposite number and the antagonist of the entire series finale, is voiced by Robert Englund, an actor whose career is defined by playing Freddy Krueger across nearly a decade of Nightmare on Elm Street films. A children's cartoon about park groundskeepers ended its story with the same voice that had haunted a generation of horror audiences, and the show never once made a show of that casting choice. It simply let it work. The visual and comedic DNA of the show borrows more directly from specific real-world sources than most viewers would guess without being told. Quintel has said in interviews that the video game ToeJam and Earl, a Sega Genesis title about two alien misfits wandering a strange world, functioned as what he called the perfect platform for thinking about Mordecai and Rigby. And if you go back and actually look at ToeJam and Earl with that in mind, the resemblance in tone, the loose wandering structure, the sense of two low-stakes companions bumbling through escalating strangeness becomes obvious almost immediately. He has also named a specific set of comedic influences that shaped his sensibility growing up. The Simpsons, Beavis and Butthead, Rocko's Modern Life, and Ren and Stimpy on the American side, and on the British side, The League of Gentlemen, The Office, and The Mighty Boosh, shows built on deadpan surrealism and awkward, prolonged social discomfort. That British influence explains a specific flavor that runs through regular show that is not quite present in most of its American animated peers, a willingness to let a joke sit in silence a beat too long, a comfort with characters simply being unpleasant to each other without an easy resolution arriving on schedule. And the music that runs constantly under the show's surface, the arcade synths, the power ballads, the 80s rock needle drops, all trace back to Quintel's own teenage years listening to that decade's music in a flat California farm town with not much else to do. This is a case where speculation and confirmed fact line up almost perfectly. Fans have long read the show's 80s obsession as thematically significant, a meditation on nostalgia and the difficulty of letting go of childhood culture, and that reading remains, by the show's own admission, a fan interpretation rather than a stated authorial thesis. But the raw presence of that 80s material in the show is not a mystery or a theory at all. It is simply what the man writing the show grew up loving, placed directly onto the screen because it made him and his collaborators laugh. Even specific episodes have concrete, mundane, real-world origins that most viewers would never guess. The episode Eggcellent, which won the show its Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Short Format Animated Program in 2012, centers on an absurd 12-egg omelet eating challenge that spirals into a surreal vision quest structured as a direct homage to the final vault sequence of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That structure was intentional and has been discussed by the creative team. But the eating challenge premise itself, the actual mechanic of finishing an enormous plate of food within a time limit to win a trucker hat and membership in an exclusive club, is not an invention of the writer's room at all. It is based on a real challenge that existed at an actual restaurant in California, the kind of blue-collar diner stunt that genuinely exists in small towns across America, stripped almost directly from life, and then escalated into a battle for Rigby's soul. The show's most emotionally significant, most mythologically loaded episode is Underneath the Cosmic Vision Quest Dressing, a documentary observation of a real thing that happens at real diners, pushed just far enough past reality to become unforgettable. The show's relationship with its own pop culture references runs deep enough that fans have spent years cataloging them individually, and while some of these are officially confirmed by cast and crew commentary, plenty circulate as fan-identified parallels that the show itself has never directly confirmed, so it's worth holding these with the appropriate looseness. The nerdiest and most heavily discussed include a Sega Master System that sits prominently in Mordecai and Rigby's living room, an actual piece of the console's hardware that even appeared physically reconstructed at a San Diego Comic-Con panel in 2012. In the episode Trash Boat, Rigby's antagonist, a furious future version of a British rock star hunting him down without explanation, has been widely read by fans as an homage to the British comic character Judge Dredd, a reading that lines up with the show's stated affection for British media, though it remains fan observation rather than a credited reference. Elsewhere, a cart chase sequence borrows the exact panic and dialogue cadence of Jurassic Park's rearview mirror scene. A mall called Two Peaks Mall echoes the Twin Pines Mall of Back to the Future almost letter for letter. A police officer bears a visual resemblance to Commissioner Gordon from the Dark Knight films, and an entire episode plot has been noted by fans as structurally mirroring a specific sequence from the sixth Star Trek film, The Undiscovered Country. The pattern keeps going once you start looking for it. Rigby's wrestling action figure closely resembles Hulk Hogan's tag team partner from the 1980s. A montage sequence carries a musical cue that fans have noted sounds remarkably close to the Rush song Tom Sawyer, never named on screen, simply echoed in the arrangement. A poster for Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon hangs quietly in the background of Muscle Man's trailer, visible for exactly as long as it takes the eye to catch it and move on. And when the show stages a musical battle against a haunted cassette tape at one point in its run, the choreography and editing mirror the climactic duel between Egg Shen and Lo Pan in the 1980s martial arts comedy Big Trouble in Little China, closely enough that fans who grew up on that film tend to recognize it within seconds. None of this was explained on screen. None of it needed to be. It was simply left there, background wallpaper, for the specific kind of viewer who had spent their own childhood absorbing the same shelf of movies and cassette tapes that the writers had. There is also a running gag buried across the show's history that the show's own parents' guide, compiled diligently by viewers over the years, has cataloged with what can only be described as remarkable dedication an entire recurring seam of jokes built around the word balls. In the episode Fuzzy Dice, Benson starts to say the phrase when the balls drop before catching himself mid-sentence and hastily rephrasing to when the game starts, the joke landing entirely on the half-second where Mordecai and Rigby's laughter tells you exactly what they thought he meant. In another episode, Rigby predicts that Benson is going to drop his balls when he sees how well a set of chairs has been arranged, the pun sitting right out in the open, deniable only because the characters never once acknowledge it directly. A separate scene set in an empty ballroom leans on the exact same joke structure, with Benson describing the elegant balls the room used to host, and Rigby immediately asking whether they were big, prompting a fresh punch to the arm from Mordecai before the moment can develop any further. This is a small, silly, deliberately juvenile thread, and it runs for the entire 8-season length of the show, tucked into scripts that otherwise carry genuine emotional weight, which is itself a fairly accurate summary of the show's whole comedic personality. There is also a subtler, more knowing gag buried in the show's background art rather than its dialogue. Several episodes place the number 420 visibly on a clock somewhere in a background shot, a wink toward cannabis culture that flies well over the head of the show's younger viewers and lands, deliberately, only for the older audience the writers knew was also watching. None of these are secrets in the sense of being hidden by the production team. They are simply the kind of dense, specific, generationally targeted references that the show layered constantly into its background art and plot structures, aimed squarely at viewers who grew up on exactly the same shelf of movies and games that Quintel did. Now, for the part of the show's history that involved actual conflict, actual phone calls, and actual consequences, because regular show's relationship with its own content rating was never as settled as the finished broadcasts made it look. In a Variety interview published in May of 2026, ahead of the revival's premiere, Quintel spoke with unusual directness about what happened 2 or 3 seasons into the original run. The show had been given a great deal of creative latitude in its early seasons, encouraged by the network to push right up against the edge of what a TV PG rating would allow, and the writers, by Quintel's own account, ran with that freedom enthusiastically. Eventually, that freedom caught up with them. Quintel has said plainly that the show began receiving calls and that executives eventually came back to the writer's room asking them to pull back, to strip out some of the material they had been getting away with up to that point. According to Quintel, this pressure came specifically from parents rather than from critics or industry watchdogs, reasoning that if the only feedback the network had been receiving was positive from executives watching ratings climb, there would have been no reason to intervene at all. The result was that the show had to retroactively pull back certain language and content choices that had been part of its identity in the earlier seasons, a quiet mid-run correction that most casual viewers would never have consciously registered as a shift, but which Quintel has now confirmed, on the record, actually happened. This pressure is visible in the finished, aired episodes themselves if you know where to look, and international broadcast records make the pattern even clearer. In the United Kingdom, Cartoon Network's own broadcast standards led to specific, documented word substitutions. In the episode Rigby's Body, every instance of the word turds, used repeatedly by multiple characters throughout the episode, was replaced in the UK broadcast with the word planks, a British insult roughly equivalent to calling someone a blockhead. In Mordecai and the Rigbys, a line where Mordecai shouts that he wants to be in a band was altered specifically to make him sound less drunk than the original delivery implied. In Ello Governor, the word crap was replaced with the word man in 2 separate lines. These are not isolated incidents. A fan-maintained archive comparing UK broadcasts against the original American versions documents this kind of substitution running consistently across nearly the entire first several seasons, with crap becoming crud as a near-universal rule, and all instances of actual swearing censored outright, with one lone exception in the word fricking, which the compiler notes was allowed through in a single episode for reasons that remain unclear. The same archive turns up smaller, stranger anomalies as well. The episode Mordecai and the Rigbys, despite receiving only a minor crap to crud edit for its television broadcast, was, for reasons the compiler could not determine, simply left off the UK's Season 1 DVD release entirely, an absence that might have been a deliberate content decision or might just as easily have been a straightforward production oversight, since nothing else about the episode's content stands out as obviously more objectionable than what aired around it. In the episode Weekend at Benson's, the UK broadcast's very first airing quietly dropped an entire drug and alcohol tinged fantasy sequence set to the song Mississippi Queen, only for the full sequence to be restored in every subsequent rerun, suggesting a same-day editorial decision that was reversed almost as quickly as it was made. And in an unrelated running joke, the show's own audience has tracked across the years a line in one episode about characters risking the loss of their own thumbs was altered for UK broadcast to a punch to the face. Instead, a change one fan archivist has noted, with some amusement, actually reads as more threatening in the edited version than in the line it was meant to soften. In the Asia-Pacific broadcast region, the censorship went considerably further, and in some cases resulted in entire episodes being pulled from rotation rather than simply edited. According to a dedicated censorship archive tracking the region's broadcast history, the episode More Smarter was refused airing outright due to references to drugs and alcohol, combined with what the archive describes as an unusually high volume of insults and threats throughout the runtime. My Mom, an episode originally scheduled to air, was instead pulled entirely and marked as too inappropriate for the network after an initial inconclusive review. 3 other episodes, Rigby's Body, It's Time, and The Night Owl, were originally refused clearance for the region entirely before eventually being rescheduled, with surviving programming records showing their delayed broadcast dates pushed back by months from their intended slots. A small but telling sign that the review process for individual episodes in that market was neither fast nor predictable, with some material simply sitting in limbo for an extended stretch before anyone made a final call on whether it could air at all. The 3-part Halloween anthology, Terror Tales of the Park, saw 2 of its 3 segments blocked from broadcast for excessive violence, with only the tamest of the 3 stories, In the House, allowed to air as a standard episode, while the other 2 remained restricted specifically for Halloween broadcast windows. The Christmas special itself was deemed too intensely violent for normal rotation and was confined to airing only during a designated holiday window each December. Individual scenes were also excised with striking specificity. In one Halloween-adjacent episode, a shot showing visible gunshot wounds on a character depicting Santa Claus was digitally painted over for the UK broadcast, an edit so precise that the archive compiling these differences notes the censors apparently missed an almost identical shot immediately afterward, since it went by too quickly to catch. Home Media and later Cartoon Network Max releases carry their own layer of retroactive editing as well. The debut episode, The Power, originally featured Rigby exclaiming a line using the letters H and S as stand-ins for stronger language, and that line was later replaced across streaming and home video releases with a fully sanitized version substituting heck and stuff. None of this happened by accident, and none of it was invisible to anyone paying close attention while it was happening. It was simply the visible residue of exactly the kind of institutional pressure Quintel would go on to describe openly more than a decade later, once enough time had passed that talking about it plainly no longer carried any risk. Even outside the specific broadcast standards conflicts, the show's own parents guide flags a handful of individual episodes as carrying an unusually heavy tone relative to the rest of the series, a distinction worth noting since it shows the writers occasionally let a single episode run considerably darker than the show's typical register without softening it for the sake of consistency. Skip's Story, the episode that lays out the character's full backstory with Mona and the immortality he never wanted, is specifically flagged by viewers as containing material some might find genuinely disturbing rather than simply sad, a rare instance of the show's comedic scaffolding falling away almost entirely to let a piece of real, unresolved grief sit on screen without a joke immediately following it to soften the landing. Between the show's 6th and 7th seasons, the world got a feature-length continuation that many casual viewers never actually saw in a theater because it barely had one. Regular Show, the movie premiered on August 14th, 2015, at the Downtown Independent, a small single-screen theater in Los Angeles, where it played for less than a week before moving to a DVD release and an eventual television premiere on Cartoon Network that November. That release strategy is itself worth pausing on. A show that had, by that point, been running successfully for 5 seasons and had already been recognized with an Emmy did not get anything resembling a wide theatrical rollout for its feature film. It got a single week in a single small independent theater, the kind of release pattern more typical of an art house documentary than a movie tied to one of basic cable's most popular animated properties, before the studio simply pivoted to the home video and broadcast markets where the show's actual audience had always lived in the first place. The film's plot sends Mordecai and Rigby back through time to confront a mistake made during their own high school years that has, in the present, begun threatening the future in ways the two of them have to physically travel back to correct. Fans who have looked closely at the timing of its release have noted, as a matter of interpretation rather than confirmed fact, that its central themes, the way small decisions made when you are still a teenager, keep reaching forward to shape the adult you eventually become, and the impossibility of simply outrunning the person you used to be, line up closely with the emotional arguments the show's final season would go on to make roughly a year and a half later. Whether the film was consciously used as a testing ground for ideas the writers knew they would eventually need for the ending remains speculation, since no member of the creative team has stated this directly on the record, but the structural echo between the two is difficult to miss once you have watched both back to back. The show's afterlife also produced a direct creative descendant rather than just a nostalgia-driven revival. After Regular Show concluded in January of 2017, Quintel announced Close Enough, an adult animated series that would eventually air on HBO Max, following a young married couple and their small daughter navigating life in Los Angeles. Quintel has described the show's origin as directly personal, explaining that Regular Show had coincided with a specific stretch of his own life, being freshly out of college and starting a job, while Close Enough was built around what he was actually living through by the time it went into production. Getting married, starting a family, and trying to buy a house while continuing to work. He voices a character named Josh in that series, meaning the same performer who spent 8 seasons voicing a directionless 23-year-old slacker spent his next major project voicing a version of himself several years further down the same road, still figuring things out, just with a mortgage and a toddler attached to the process now. Close Enough carries its own small piece of behind-the-scenes turbulence worth naming here, too, since it shows that Quintel's post-Regular Show career was not simply a smooth continuation of his earlier success. The series was originally developed and produced for TBS, a network with essentially no history of carrying adult animation, before the show ultimately moved over to HBO Max ahead of its actual premiere, a fairly unusual mid-development network swap that speaks to how unsettled the adult animation streaming landscape still was at that particular moment, with executives at multiple companies clearly uncertain about exactly where a project like this actually belonged. Close Enough ran for 3 seasons before its cancellation, and it received its own recognition within the industry, earning an Annie Award nomination for Outstanding Voice Acting Achievement in 2021, with the show as a whole nominated in the category of Best General Audience Animated Television Production at the same ceremony. The show's finale carries its own layer of production secrets, separate entirely from the fan theories about what the ending symbolizes. In an interview conducted with Animation Magazine and published in February of 2017, right around the finale's original broadcast, Quintel described the actual mechanical process of building the ending, and one detail stands out as a small but genuine piece of production trivia. In the final episode, Pops gets knocked directly into a scene from The Naive Man from Lollyland, the actual student film Quintel made back at Cal Arts, meaning the finale physically incorporates footage from the show's real origin point, closing the loop between the earliest thing Quintel ever made and the very last thing the original series would ever show. But the student film had been shot with specific cuts built into its editing. A shot of 2 characters talking, followed by a close-up, followed by a return to the wide shot, and that original cutting pattern simply did not work for the moment the finale needed to create. The animation team in Korea ended up having to build entirely new animation to bridge the gap, deliberately made to visually match the rough, dated style of the original decade-old student film, so that a viewer watching the finale would believe they were looking at unaltered footage from 2005. When in fact, a significant portion of what appears on screen was freshly produced specifically to blend seamlessly with material that was genuinely more than a decade old by the time it aired. The decision to send the final season into space and to end the show with Pops's death did not arrive as a single flash of inspiration either. Quintel has described the space arc idea as something that had circulated loosely in the writer's room for years before it was ever used, always dismissed on the grounds that it felt like an ending, and therefore something that should be saved rather than spent early. It was only once the show's eventual conclusion became a certainty, sometime in the middle of the 7th season, that the idea finally got greenlit, freeing the writers to attempt something they had deliberately been withholding from themselves for the entire run. Quintel has also spoken candidly about how personal the writer's room found the actual content of the ending, noting that many of the people who had worked on the show for years were, by that point, getting married and starting families of their own, and that the choice to give Mordecai, Rigby, and the rest of the cast quiet, ordinary, settled adult lives rather than some grander conventional triumph was shaped directly by where the actual writers in the room found themselves in their own lives at the time. One detail that has taken on a strange afterlife of its own concerns the unnamed woman Mordecai is shown married to in the finale's closing time skip. The character is never given a name on screen. Head writer Matt Price later gave her the name Steph in an offhand Reddit comment, explaining it as a nod to Quintel's love of the film The Goonies, while another writer, Owen Dennis, noted on his own social media that there had actually been no prior plan to name the character at all before that comment. The name that many fans now treat as settled canon originated, verifiably, as an off-the-cuff joke from a writer answering questions online well after the show had already ended, rather than as anything scripted or planned during production itself. A handful of smaller, stranger production choices sit inside the finale's actual runtime that tend to get lost underneath the weight of Pops's death, simply because that single moment absorbs so much of the audience's attention. The battle itself is staged on an alien world identified in the finale as belonging to natives who explain directly to the visiting park crew that Pops is the perfect creation of a planet called Megacranus, while Anti-Pops was deliberately created as his opposite from a corresponding source called Malum Cranus, specifically to maintain balance across the universe. Those natives show the visiting cast a set of ancient carved murals depicting the previous incarnations of this exact fight, stretching back across cycle after cycle, each one ending the same way, in a stalemate that simply resets the universe rather than resolving anything. It is Mordecai, not Pops, who actually engineers the strategy that finally breaks that cycle, coming up with the idea to lay physical traps for Anti-Pops, specifically to give his friend an advantage no previous incarnation of Pops had ever had. And the tone of the fight itself keeps a thread of the show's essential silliness running right up until its most serious moment. Anti-Pops does not simply appear to fight his brother. He arrives by hailing what is depicted as a space-themed rideshare service, driven by a background character named Guilfoyle, whose real passion, according to the joke the writers built into the scene, is DJing rather than driving, and the sequence plays the absurdity completely straight, dropping a rideshare gag directly into the build-up to a battle for the fate of existence without ever winking at the audience about how strange that juxtaposition actually is. The episode immediately preceding that battle, titled Cheer Up Pops, spends its entire runtime on the park crew trying, in increasingly desperate and specific ways, to distract Pops from the anxiety of what is coming. Mordecai and Rigby write him a rap. Benson bakes him a cake deliberately decorated to resemble Pops's own bloodied face, an image meant as morale-boosting gallows humor rather than anything sincerely grim. Muscle Man and Skips set off fireworks. Eventually, the distraction curdles into an actual party, one that ends up drawing together a wide swath of the show's extended supporting cast, including the rarely seen Guardians of Eternal Youth, in what functions as a kind of unannounced goodbye gathering disguised as a celebration. It is also worth naming plainly, since it tends to get treated as an assumed fact rather than something worth actually stating out loud, that Pops's death in the finale represents the first time in the entire 8-season run that a genuinely central, ongoing member of the main cast is killed off permanently, with the show declining to walk the moment back through any of the resurrection tricks, deals with death, or time travel loopholes it had spent years establishing as available options within its own universe. Every other brush with mortality across the show's history had come with an exit ramp. This one, deliberately, did not. The revival's own official plot description released by the studio ahead of the May 2026 premiere, frames the new series in language that could just as easily describe any single season of the original run, which seems to have been very much the point. It describes Mordecai and Rigby's jobs spiraling into surreal chaos through everything from crashing a friend's luau to searching for the single best spot in the park to take a nap, with avoiding work quickly turning into thwarting one disaster after another. The continuity is deliberate. The studio was not describing a spin-off with a new premise. It was describing the exact same show, picking back up as though the 9-year gap had simply been an unusually long commercial break. There is one more layer worth naming here, since it involves a voice that has nothing at all to do with the English broadcast most fans grew up with. Skips carries a Japanese dub as well, voiced by an actor named Hiroshi Shirokuma, which means that in at least one other language, an entirely different performer has spent years shaping the vocal identity of the immortal Yeti that, in English, belongs so completely to Mark Hamill that most fans have never even paused to wonder what the character might sound like filtered through somebody else's voice entirely. The music that plays under the finale's closing montage, David Bowie's Heroes, was a deliberate licensing choice that the crew has since described as one of the show's proudest achievements, made possible by a studio willing to pursue licensed music throughout the show's run, rather than relying solely on an in-house score. In a later interview promoting the revival, conducted after the final season of the Netflix series Stranger Things closed its own final episode using the exact same Bowie song, several members of the regular show creative team, including head writer Matt Price and executive producer Sean Sealis, addressed the coincidence directly and, with evident good humor, jokingly insisted that the bigger, more famous show had in fact copied them. The finale also received recognition beyond fan affection. The show as a whole was nominated for 6 Emmy Awards across its run and won once in 2012 for Excellent in the category of Outstanding Short Format Animated Program. That was far from its only formal recognition. The series picked up an Annie Award nomination for Outstanding Achievement in Storyboarding for a television production in 2012, credited to writer and storyboard artist Benton Connor, and went on to receive additional Annie nominations in the categories of Best Animated Television or Broadcast Production for a Children's Audience in 2014 and Best General Audience Animated Television or Broadcast Production in 2015, placing it in direct competition for industry recognition against the best animated programming being produced anywhere in the country during those years. Its reach extended past the United States as well. Regular Show earned a nomination for Favorite Animated Series at the 2014 Kids' Choice Awards Mexico, a small but telling sign of how far the show's specific brand of slacker surrealism had traveled beyond its original English-language broadcast. And in the show's very first year on air, it received a nomination in the Children's International category at the British Academy Children's BAFTA Awards for 2011, recognition that arrived before the show had even finished establishing itself, let alone before anyone involved had any real sense of how long its eventual run would turn out to be. It holds a 96% score on Rotten Tomatoes today, an unusually high consensus figure for an animated comedy that spent much of its original broadcast run being dismissed by casual viewers as simple slacker humor for kids. The finale's 3 parts aired as the most watched episodes of the entire 8th season, drawing 1.33 million viewers for the first part and 1.37 million each for the second and third. Respectable numbers for a cable animated series airing its very last new episodes nearly 7 years into its run, at a point when many long-running shows have already bled off the bulk of their original audience. Its afterlife on streaming has proven remarkably durable in the years since, with regular show landing in Netflix's global top 10 list in the week of February 5th, 2024, 7 full years after its original conclusion, a placement that, according to reporting at the time, put it ahead of Young Sheldon's 6th season in the same ranking that week, a genuinely strange piece of trivia to sit with when you remember that the two shows have nothing at all in common beyond both airing new content 7 years apart, competing for exactly the same viewers on exactly the same platform. Its performance during its actual original broadcast run was, by the standard measures the industry uses, a genuine rating success rather than a cult curiosity that only found its audience later. Nielsen Media Research ranked the series at number 1 in its specific broadcast time slot among its primary target demographic during its first 2 seasons, and by 2013, the show was averaging somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million viewers on a weekly basis, respectable numbers for basic cable animation at that point in the decade. For a stretch in the early 2010s, regular show stood alongside Adventure Time and Johnny Test as one of the 3 flagship series carrying Cartoon Network's daily lineup, with frequent reruns, regular marathon programming blocks, and heavy promotional support from the network. And its relationship with rerun scheduling did not simply fade into the background once the original run ended in 2017. Cartoon Network began running the show heavily again in 2022, starting with occasional weekend marathon blocks before expanding, by the fall of that year, into airing episodes on almost every single weeknight. By late 2023, the show's rerun presence had grown so dense that it was airing every single day, at a frequency reportedly nearly double that of Teen Titans Go, one of the network's other long-running mainstays, meaning a show that first aired well over a decade earlier was, at that specific point, taking up more actual airtime on the network than shows made far more recently. There is also a small, quietly funny piece of writer's room trivia worth knowing here, the kind that only surfaces because someone eventually asked the right question at the right convention panel. Writer Matt Price has said openly that he personally thought it would have been funny, narratively, if Don, Margaret's one-time boyfriend and one of the more minor recurring characters in the early seasons, had actually ended up together with Margaret rather than the show moving her relationships in the direction it eventually did. Price has admitted, with some resignation, that he appeared to be the only person in the entire writer's room who genuinely liked Dawn as a character, which meant that particular pairing never had any realistic chance of making it into the actual scripts, no matter how much one writer in the room might have privately rooted for it. Before any of that, the show had already made its way into players' hands directly through a project Quintel announced himself, in his own words, over social media. On April 8th, 2013, he posted that a real regular show video game was actually coming, adding, almost apologetically, that it was for real, as if he expected fans not to believe him. That game, regular show, Mordecai and Rigby in 8-Bit Land, was developed by WayForward Technologies and released exclusively for the Nintendo 3DS in the fall of 2013, arriving alongside 2 sibling titles built on the same handheld hardware, an Adventure Time dungeon crawler and a Ben 10 game, all 3 announced together by Cartoon Network and their publishing partner in a single wave of licensed releases. The premise draws directly from the 2-part 4th season premiere Exit 9B, with Mordecai and Rigby literally sold inside a television screen and forced to fight their way through 4 themed worlds built from the show's own visual language, switching between a platforming mode, where Mordecai can double jump and Rigby can crawl into tight spaces, a side-scrolling shooter mode, where Mordecai becomes a small spaceship, and a top-down shooter mode built entirely around Rigby. The game's story was written by Quintel himself, and it used dialogue recorded by the show's actual voice cast rather than relying on cheaper stand-in performers, a detail that meant even a budget handheld tie-in carried the real vocal texture of the show rather than an approximation of it. It has not aged into permanent availability. The title was quietly delisted from the Nintendo eShop at some point between 2017 and 2019, almost certainly due to an expiring license agreement, meaning a game built from the show's own creators' direct involvement now exists only on physical cartridges still circulating through resale markets, already halfway toward becoming its own small, forgotten artifact of the show's history. The show's world extended past the television screen in other ways that many casual fans never fully tracked. Boom! Studios published a regular show comic book series under their all-ages Kaboom imprint, running as a 40-issue main series alongside additional graphic novels, specials, and miniseries, including a 6-issue Skips focused miniseries that dug into the character's backstory in more detail than the television series itself ever had room for, and a later 6-issue crossover miniseries that directly combined the worlds of regular show and Adventure Time, giving those 2 CalArts sibling shows an actual shared narrative for the first time, something the fan community had speculated about for years without ever expecting it to become literal, official continuity. And then, after 9 years of silence, the show came back, and the story of how that happened is itself one of the more interesting secrets here, because for most of that decade, nobody outside the production had any real reason to expect it. According to Wikipedia's own sourced account, series creator J.G. Quintel was already deep into developing a different, unrelated project, an adult animated adaptation of the webcomic Super Mutant Magic Academy intended for Adult Swim when he was approached in early 2024 by Lauren Martinez, then the vice president for series at Cartoon Network Studios, and asked directly whether he would be interested in bringing regular show back. The revival, eventually titled Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, was formally announced at the Annecy International Animation Film Festival in June of 2024, with Quintel returning as showrunner and Warner Brothers Discovery greenlighting a full 2-season order. In September of that same year, Mark Hamill confirmed publicly that he would return as Skips. Sam Marin, William Salyers, and Minty Lewis all followed, meaning the overwhelming majority of the original core cast returned to their original roles rather than being recast, a rarity for animated revivals arriving nearly a decade after a show's original conclusion. The project's working title, actually leaked before any official confirmation, discovered by fans who noticed a Warner Brothers Discovery internship job listing referencing a production titled Regular Show, Lost Tapes months before the studio made any formal announcement about what that title referred to. The Lost Tapes premiered globally on Cartoon Network on May 11th, 2026, with a special half-hour episode before arriving on HBO Max and Hulu in the United States the following month. It was ordered initially for 40 episodes total, with the first 10 airing on Cartoon Network and 30 additional episodes to follow. Quintel has said directly in that same Variety interview from May of 2026 that the years of separation from the show left the entire returning creative team seeing the material with new perspective, and that the passage of time meant everyone involved came back with far more ideas than they would ever have had access to had the show simply continued without interruption. He has also confirmed that the writing team behind the revival largely consists of the same writers, storyboard artists, and story people who worked on the original run, meaning the voice and sensibility carrying the show forward is not a new generation's interpretation of an old property, but substantially the same group of people who built the thing the first time, returning to do it again with the specific benefit of 9 years of additional life experience between them. According to Quintel's own account, the show's tone has also loosened back toward its earlier, less restricted years, since the network pressure that forced the mid-run correction back in the original broadcast no longer applies in the same way to a Max and Hulu distributed revival, and Quintel has spoken about being able to lean back into some of what he describes as the material that originally made the show what it was, rather than working under the same constraints that shaped the later original seasons. The road to that May premiere had its own smaller stretch of leaked and half-confirmed detail along the way, the ordinary noise of a production trying to keep secrets while working inside an industry that rarely lets it. In August of 2025, character designer Ben Adams told the Regular Show Wiki directly in an interview conducted for the fan community itself rather than through any official studio channel that an Eileen-centered episode was already in production, a small but pointed confirmation that the revival intended to keep expanding the emotional lives of the supporting cast rather than simply rehashing Mordecai and Rigby's original dynamic. Head writer Matt Price separately confirmed the 2026 premiere target to the same fan-run wiki before any studio press release had gone out. Sam Register, the president of Warner Brothers Animation and Cartoon Network Studios, offered his own summary of the whole 9-year gap when the first promotional materials went out, joking that if Quintel had not worked harder than his own characters, the audience might have had to wait even longer than 9 years to see Mordecai and Rigby again, a line that draws a direct, deliberate connection between the show's fictional laziness and the very real effort required to actually bring it back. There was, for a stretch, genuine uncertainty about where the revival would even end up airing, with some reporting suggesting Adult Swim as a possible home given the older skew of the show's humor, before Cartoon Network itself was confirmed as the actual destination. Reviews upon release were generally positive, with one outlet describing the new series as the same absurdity with an updated visual look, and another calling it a familiar return that does not miss a beat, though at least one piece of reporting noted an odd early stumble, observing that Disney Plus had briefly and seemingly accidentally listed 2 unreleased episodes of the revival before they had aired anywhere else in the world, a minor scheduling error that briefly gave a small number of viewers access to material nobody else on the planet had seen yet. Death himself, the recurring British biker figure who shows up throughout the series to collect characters who have died and who is occasionally talked out of finishing the job, is voiced by Julian Holloway, an actor whose career stretches back decades in British film and television, which goes some distance toward explaining why the character's specific mixture of dry formality and biker cool feels so natural rather than like a cartoonish approximation of an accent. Steve Blum, meanwhile, voices Carter, also known as Muscle Bro, across 31 episodes of the show's run, a name that carries considerably more weight in the broader animation and video game industry than the character's relatively minor role in regular show might suggest. Blum is one of the most prolific voice actors working today, with a resume that includes Wolverine across multiple animated projects and Spike Spiegel in the English dub of Cowboy Bebop, meaning a character who mostly exists to be one of Muscle Man's interchangeable, shirt-spinning friends is, underneath the surface, being performed by a voice with real weight and history behind it. The show's reach beyond English language broadcast extended further than most fans watching the original American airings would have had any reason to think about. In France, the series began airing on Cartoon Network in October of 2011, carried within a programming block called Cartoon Network VIP, under its original English title rather than a translated one, a choice that meant French audiences were, from the very beginning, encountering Mordecai and Rigby's names exactly as American viewers were, with no localized rebranding softening the transition into another language and culture. The show's pilot episode drew just at over 2 million viewers on its very first broadcast in its home market, and viewership on the episodes that followed reportedly doubled from there, a rare and immediate sign, even in that first season, that Cartoon Network had found something with staying power rather than simply another mid-tier comedy filling out a Monday afternoon schedule. The show's official content rating in its home market carries its own small piece of bureaucratic trivia worth knowing, since it explains why certain episodes look, on paper, more heavily flagged than others, despite airing within the exact same overall series. Regular show carried a general TVPG rating for its full run, but individual episodes occasionally received additional descriptor letters attached specifically for that installment, with Brain Eraser flagged separately for suggestive dialogue, and episodes built around larger action set pieces, including Fuzzy Dice and Stake Me Amadeus, flagged specifically for moderate violence involving firearms. This meant that the show's rating was never actually static across its own run. It flexed episode by episode, tightening or loosening depending on what a given script actually required, a level of granularity in broadcast standards labeling that most viewers would never notice unless they went looking specifically for it, the same way almost everything else in this particular history stayed invisible until someone bothered to go and check. The show's approach to guest casting reached well outside its regular ensemble in ways that most viewers likely registered only as a vaguely familiar voice without ever placing the name behind it. Amy Sedaris, the comedian and actress known for her work on Strangers with Candy and later At Home with Amy Sedaris, voiced a character named Mrs. Kessler in one episode. James Hong, an actor whose screen career stretches back more than 70 years and includes Big Trouble in Little China and Blade Runner, voiced a character called Mr. Zhang. And Matthew Mercer, a voice actor and Dungeons & Dragons personality who would go on to become one of the most recognized names in the tabletop and voice acting community through his work on Critical Role, appeared as a character named Dr. Sweet Dreams. None of these were headline casting announcements at the time. They were the kind of small, one-off guest appearances that a show can quietly stack into its margins once it has built enough goodwill and industry relationships to attract performers who did not need the work but simply wanted to be a part of it. Mark Hamill's own list of background contributions beyond skips runs longer than most fans would expect from an actor of his stature. Across the show's run, he also voiced a wizard, Benson's father, a background character referred to only as Destroyer of Worlds, a character named Gunnar von Strauss, Margaret's boss in one episode, a Thanksgiving reenactor in the Thanksgiving special, and Carlock King in an episode about a video game tournament, among a long list of other one-off roles credited simply as guy, man, or officer. The show's credits, if you actually sit and read them in full rather than letting them scroll past, reveal a performer clearly enjoying the freedom of a project where nobody was counting how many separate characters he touched in a single season. Even the print side of the show carried its own specific creative fingerprints worth naming. The Boom Studios comic series that launched in 2013 credited writer KC Green and artist Alison Stralow on its earliest issues, with cover art contributed across different releases by artists including Nick Edwards, Chris Gashoughton, whose own credits include work on the Adventure Time comic, and Dustin Nguyen, an artist better known in most comic shops for his work on Batman. The presence of a Batman artist and an Adventure Time artist, both contributing cover work to regular show's earliest comic issues, is a small, concrete reminder of just how tightly interconnected the animation and comics side of this specific era of Cartoon Network's properties actually were, with talent moving fluidly between properties that on screen never crossed paths at all until years later. The show's own official record of its creative process exists in a form most fans have never actually opened. A dedicated behind-the-scenes book titled The Art of Regular Show was published featuring in-depth interviews with the show's creators and voice actors, alongside a substantial collection of never-before-seen original artwork, tracing the visual development of the series from Quintel's earliest sketches through storyboards and finished episode art, along with doodles pulled directly from writers' meetings and early character development work. The book gives disproportionate attention to 4 specific productions within the show's run: the original pilot, Excellent, the 2-part episode Exit 9B, and the Christmas special, treating those 4 as the clearest windows into how the show's visual and narrative identity actually took shape over time. For a series so often remembered as visually simple, almost deliberately crude in its character designs, the sheer density of behind-the-scenes material collected for that one book tells a different story, one where a huge amount of design thought went into making something look effortless. Even the physical object itself carries a small design flourish worth noting. The book's cover was produced with a 3-dimensional effect built directly into the printing, a small tactile gimmick that turns the collected archive of a show about doing as little work as humanly possible into, ironically, one of the more elaborately produced pieces of official merchandise the franchise ever released. The show's season-by-season release schedule also followed a rhythm that most casual viewers, watching in reruns or on streaming, would never have any reason to reconstruct. The 5th season ran from September of 2013 through August of 2014. The 6th ran from October of 2014 through June of 2015. The 7th stretched from June of 2015 into June of 2016. And the 8th and final season, the one that would eventually take the entire cast into space and end with Pops's death, began in September of 2016 and concluded with the finale in January of 2017. The announcement that this 8th season would in fact be the show's last arrived in a joint statement from Quintel and Cartoon Network roughly 2 weeks before that final season's premiere, meaning even the show's most devoted fans found out they were entering the final stretch only shortly before it actually began airing, without the kind of extended farewell tour some long-running series are given. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from being the person whose name is on a show, and Quintel has talked about it with more honesty than most creators bother to offer once a project is finally finished. He has described being unusually particular in the early seasons, deliberately searching for collaborators who could actually match the show's specific tone and sensibility, and then sitting back to watch what they produced, sometimes surprised by a joke or a choice he would never have thought of himself, and sometimes recognizing immediately that a given draft was not right yet, that the room could still do better. He has also said that because he functioned as the final round of notes on nearly everything the show produced, any fix that needed to happen fell to him personally, with no additional pay or formal credit attached to the extra work, simply the ordinary, invisible cost of being the person ultimately responsible for whether a joke actually landed. That responsibility did not get easier as the seasons went on. If anything, Quintel has suggested the opposite, describing a specific, recurring worry that crept in during the later years. A sense that certain premises had already been done, that the team had to keep proving to itself that it could still be funnier than its own earlier work, season after season, without the difficulty of that task ever visibly showing up in the finished episodes themselves. The show's expanded universe in print carries its own smaller, quieter secrets as well, tucked away from anyone who only ever followed the series on screen. The main regular show comic series itself ran considerably longer than most fans would guess, stretching across 40 individual issues published between May of 2013 and December of 2018, meaning new licensed regular show comics were still hitting shelves nearly 2 full years after the television series had already broadcast its finale, quietly continuing the property's presence in stores well past the point most casual viewers assumed everything connected to the show had wrapped up for good. The Skips-focused miniseries, published by Boom Studios, ran for 6 issues between November of 2013 and April of 2014, giving the characters' centuries-long backstory considerably more room to breathe than the television series, constrained as it was to 11-minute episodes, ever had the runtime to provide. A separate crossover miniseries later paired regular show directly with Adventure Time across 6 issues, running from August of 2017 into January of 2018, meaning the two CalArts sibling shows that had spent years airing side by side without ever officially sharing a story finally did so, not on television, but in a format small enough that plenty of longtime fans of both shows never even knew it existed. There was also a smaller, more informal wave of supplementary material, released even later than that, a set of short comic stories written and illustrated by artist Madeline Querapel and posted directly to Tumblr as free companion pieces timed to the show's 8th and final season, meaning some of the very last officially sanctioned regular show content to ever be produced connected to the original run did not arrive through a publisher, a network, or a store shelf at all, but simply appeared on a social media platform, free for anyone who happened to be following along closely enough to find it. There is one more piece of trivia worth sitting with before we close this out, because it says something honest about what all of this actually adds up to for the person who made it. In a 2024 interview, Quintel described the strange experience of realizing, well after the show's original run had ended, just how far its reach had actually gone. He described people recognizing him in public, ordering food and having a stranger comp his meal simply for being the show's creator, meeting teenagers who told him it was their favorite show, despite not having been born when it first aired, And in one detail he singled out specifically, seeing a photograph from an annual White House Halloween event showing a child dressed as Skips standing behind the sitting President of the United States. He has also mentioned in the same breath learning that fans had started getting tattoos of the show's characters permanently inked onto their own skin, a level of devotion he has said still genuinely surprises him even now, years after the fact, since it represents a kind of commitment to the material that goes well beyond simply enjoying a rerun on a Saturday afternoon. Quintel has said plainly that he never expected any of this. He assumed, going in, that the show might run 2 or 3 seasons if it was lucky, and instead it ran for 8, came back for a 9th, and ended up dressed as a costume behind the most photographed office in the country. That is not a theory about what the park represents. That is simply what actually happened to a stop-motion short made by a bored 16-year-old with Lego men and a borrowed video camera in a flat little farm town where there was not a ton to do. Every fact in this video, from the canceled pilot program to the phone calls from parents to the White House Halloween costume, traces back, in one way or another, to that same starting point, a kid with nothing much to do and a camera he had just been handed, which might be the single most fitting origin story a show about manufacturing your own excitement out of boredom could possibly have. That is where this particular thread runs out, at least for tonight. A show that almost died twice before it ever aired a single frame, built by a small circle of art school friends who are still, in large part, the same people running it today. A cast where one man's voice quietly carries 3 separate characters through arguments with each other, where a Star Wars legend voiced an immortal Yeti and privately doubted his own performance the whole time, where a Nightmare on Elm Street icon closed out a children's cartoon's cosmic war, a production pipeline that stretched across 2 continents and 9 months for 11 minutes of finished television, a finale built partly out of new animation designed specifically to look old, closing with a wife's name invented as a joke on Reddit years after the fact, set to a song that a much larger show would later borrow for its own ending. Executives asking a group of writers to tone it down, and the writers, given enough time and a streaming platform instead of a broadcast network, eventually getting to loosen the collar back up. None of it needed to be a theory. All of it just needed someone to go and actually look. Think, for a second, about how strange it actually is that a show this loose, this scrappy-looking, this willing to let a joke breathe past the point of comfort, was in fact the product of 9 months of labor spread across 2 continents, storyboarded by hand, animated frame by artists in Seoul who never appeared in a single credit most viewers would recognize, shipped back across an ocean, assembled, approved, and then finally handed to an audience who would spend 11 minutes with it and move on to whatever came next. That gap between how effortless something looks and how much labor it actually took to look that way sits underneath almost every secret we have gone through tonight. It is there in a voice actor doing 3 arguing characters in one booth and making the argument sound like 2 separate people who have never once realized they are the same. It is there in an 80s loving kid from a flat farm town, turning his own boredom into the emotional architecture of an entire television series without ever once naming it as autobiography on screen. It is there in a canceled pilot program that could have erased the whole thing before a single episode ever aired, saved only because one short out of 39 happened to be good enough and different enough for two executives to take a chance on it anyway. And it is there, too, in the quieter, more uncomfortable secrets, the parents making phone calls, the network asking a group of writers to become smaller than they wanted to be, the specific words a British broadcast standard quietly swapped out of a raccoon's mouth without ever telling the audience it had happened. A show remembered now, in reruns and in a brand new revival airing 9 years later, as something gentle and beloved, carries inside its own history a record of exactly how much friction it took to get there, how many small compromises and corrections and unlikely castings had to line up in sequence for the thing to survive long enough to become the thing people actually love. That friction does not show up anywhere in the finished episodes. It was never meant to. That is precisely what makes it worth going and finding. If you found something in here you didn't already know, that's really the whole point of a video like this, and there's a lot more of the show still worth digging into if this kind of thing is what you're after. Let it sit with you for a minute before you go. The park is still there, in reruns, and in the new episodes airing right now, and so is the story behind how it ever got built in the first place, still waiting, mostly unremarked on, for anyone curious enough to go looking for it the way we did tonight. If you enjoyed spending this time here, go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.